Well, hello everyone. My name is John Leatherman. I'd like to welcome you to our CAPE training program. I'm located at Kansas State University. I'd also like to acknowledge my close partners in this training project. Mark Skidmore, the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, Rosa Solas McKelvey, Communication and Logistics Coordinator for the center, as well as Paula Miller, our CAPE postdoctoral fellow working on the project. Once again, CAPE is Community Assessment and Education to promote behavioral health planning and evaluation. It's a co-sponsored initiative by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the United States Department of Agriculture, as well as the USDA Regional Rural Development Centers. The partnership is intended to identify and disseminate more effective response strategies to the challenges of mental illness and substance abuse found within our communities. Our project has two principal objectives. First is to enhance behavioral health literacy, and we've utilized the Mental Health First Aid Training Program to try to achieve that objective. And our second objective is to create and sustain community coalitions capable of addressing local behavioral health needs. And we are doing that with this training program, talking about organizing community scale initiatives that can essentially respond to the needs that exist within the community. Our CAPE training program, at this point we are discussing community needs assessment. We'll have a series of videos that discuss certain other aspects of organizing a community scale initiative, leading to the notion of developing a strategic action plan for your community, and ultimately we'll utilize that information to undertake some initiatives in the communities that you serve, and we'll see how you're doing after a period of time, and perhaps try to offer some suggestions and assistance to keep things going in a positive direction. In our session today, we're going to talk principally about primary data gathering, information directly from within your community, and we'll make a few comments about essentially crafting what we call evidence-based arguments as you present your information in relation to community behavioral health needs and priorities. Oftentimes we'd like to conduct, and we in Extension frequently will undertake various types of community surveys. And indeed, you will find at our CAPE website a very nice primer relating to conducting community behavioral health surveys that was put together by Courtney Cuthbertson and Scott Loveridge at Michigan State University, and I draw upon that as I offer some of my suggestions and comments. Now, in conducting a survey directly within the community, there are really a variety of benefits associated with it as well as costs. The benefits associated with conducting a local survey are that it is information that's very specific to the community. We have the capacity through a survey to generate a lot of information quickly, and we can generate some unique information with regard to levels of awareness or perceptions or levels of behavior within our community. The costs associated with conducting a local survey is it can indeed be an expensive proposition. It is oftentimes very difficult to construct, analyze, and interpret the results of a survey, and we run the danger that it can in fact generate more confusion than clarity. And so the process of initiating and conducting a survey is one that needs to be done very, very carefully. When is a survey right for a given community? Well, when you're seeking perhaps representative views of the community. If you're seeking to understand subsets of the population, you have the opportunity to do so through a community survey. If you're interested in learning more about new and emerging problems, a survey may be the way to go. if you're seeking some sort of geographic specificity of a sub-geography of a larger community, or perhaps problems in a particular neighborhood, a survey can be a very helpful tool to accomplish that. Or if you're looking to assess the effectiveness of some sort of policy or intervention, a survey may be appropriate. Now, there are a host of survey approaches, all of which have their strengths and all of which have their limitations. We perhaps most frequently think of mail surveys, but mail surveys also tend to be fairly costly. They tend to be very labor intensive by way of data entry and analysis, and we always face the problem of a self-selection bias, or a bias that is associated with people who choose to respond versus those who do not. And that can perhaps create some uncertainty as to the representativeness of the results that we are considering. Telephone surveys are frequently utilized as well, but they also tend to be fairly labor intensive and very, very costly. And with the rise of wireless communication technology, that has created a whole new challenge with regard to utilizing telephone-based surveys. As people have moved away from their landlines, the localized telephone number lists that you're able to access and purchase generally tend to be of fairly poor quality for sub-state regions. And generally, telephone surveys are more reliable and effective at a state scale or even at a national scale. We are increasingly utilizing web-based surveys. These actually tend to be somewhat faster and easier to gather information and analyze that information. But then we also face the challenges of obtaining the email contact information that we might want to utilize in order to send out invitations to participate. And we are also facing the issue of self-selection bias for those who would choose to respond versus those who would not. Finally, there are face-to-face surveys. These tend to be the most costly and time-consuming, and generally tend to be better for fairly discrete kinds of events, as opposed to somewhat of a broader, more general initiative. We address the issue of survey sampling. Of course, census is most desirable. That would be the notion of asking everyone within the population that we are interested in, but that frequently is not very feasible, just given the scale of the undertaking. And so frequently we utilize some sort of a sampling method. And sort of the gold standard for sampling is a random sample, where indeed everybody has an equal opportunity to be selected and invited to participate in the survey. But indeed, there are challenges associated with truly obtaining a random sample for a mail survey or a telephone list. Because indeed not everyone would be represented among those lists. There are all alternative lists also have their limitations and problems, and even under a random sampling scenario, the self-selection bias is a potential issue. Frequently, what we turn to is something called cluster sampling, where we oversample certain segments of the population for certain subsets. We may geographically target an area, or we may want to target people with a certain demographic, and that would be termed some type of a cluster sample. And finally, we have to once again recognize the problems associated with non-response or self-selection bias. In this day and age, there is really a challenge of trust, just given the volume of these types of activities that we're invited to participate in, frequently many of which have some very questionable motivation behind them, and indeed perhaps are more often than not solicitation for some sort of financial contribution. We do need to acknowledge the importance of survey ethics, and indeed, we within the university have a particular responsibility insofar as we need to be transparent about what we are trying to do and obtain informed consent of the survey respondent. And indeed, the guidelines that we need to be following within the university is what we're doing and why we're doing it. That an individual respondent has the opportunity to refuse to respond to anything or to withdraw from the survey at any time. If there are any risks associated with the information that we're trying to solicit, we need to be straightforward about that. We need to be able to assure the anonymity of the respondent, and we need to ensure that the data that we gather is going to be essentially safeguarded. And those are the requirements that we have within the university system. And we also have to be very, very careful about certain vulnerable populations, and that might include individuals with mental or behavioral disabilities, individuals who may be perhaps considered as a captive audience, as well as being very, very careful when we're dealing with children. Universities have things called institutional review boards. You're strongly encouraged to utilize it before you undertake any sort of a survey initiative, even if it is within your home community. As a representative of the university, we are subject to these kinds of requirements. Another alternative is something that we call key informants. And this would be what would be called a stratified sampling of leaders or other individuals with specialized information that we might be interested in obtaining. And that is to say that essentially what we do is we seek out individuals that we believe possess representative and specialized knowledge of what we are interested in learning about. This generally tends to be a much less expensive approach than an overall survey, and generally we're going to achieve a better response rate overall. But it also tends to be non-random, and information that we may obtain with regard to the incidence of a certain issue or problem may not be especially reliable depending on the individuals that we are talking to. Now, a few words about designing surveys. In general, it's a good idea that each question is framed in a way that can be interpreted as a yes or a no answer, or can be quantified in a very specific way. Those are the best kinds of answers or questions to ask individuals. We also have to avoid any kind of a question that involves a compound sentence. If you're inclined to incorporate the word "and," you're actually asking two questions, not one. And so we need to avoid compound questions. We need to be very, very careful about leading questions that imply a certain socially desirable response. And we need to avoid the use of any negative words within any of our questions. They all need to be framed in a fashion that is in some way positive. If we're offering a choice among a variety of things, the choice set should be exhaustive and include all possibilities. Opinion choices should be nuanced. It shouldn't, if it's asking about an opinion, it's better to put it in terms of a 5-point scale of strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, so that people have a little bit of nuance associated with their views. And frequently, it's often very, very helpful to obtain demographic information, but that can help us perhaps to understand something about population subsets. But at the same time, we need to be very, very careful about the problem of numbers and generalizing to subsets of the population with insufficient data to do so. few words about length, complexity, and timing. In general, it's a good idea that surveys be as short as possible. And in general, if there's an alternative source of information to about the issue that you're concerned with, it's better to utilize the alternative instead of utilizing a survey. There needs to be some sort of a plan for how you're going to analyze and utilize the data, and if you don't know at the front end, you probably need to rethink undertaking the survey until you've got that figured out. And then you have to ask yourself, is the respondent in a position to know the answer to a question? And indeed, we've seen that in the past where there's no possible way this person could know this information that we're asking of them. And so we need to ensure that a respondent knows the answer that we're looking for. Pre-testing is always a good idea. I've seen it time and again where it would seem that after all the results are collected, we find that people were perhaps responding in a way that we didn't anticipate, or perhaps not understanding exactly what we were asking for. Pre-testing helps to see if it actually works. There's a question of timing. It used to be the case when we were more dependent on such things as mail surveys. Timing seemed to be very important as to when people would get it during the course of the week and so forth. That perhaps is weakened a little bit in the age of the internet, where it's a little bit uncertain as to the exact day of the week, time of the day, and so forth will help or hurt our effort. And it's always a good idea, finally, to do follow-up, to repeat our efforts at obtaining a response from a given targeted respondent, and to try on multiple occasions to obtain that information if they are part of our sample. Once we've obtained our results, there's kind of a basic formula that we might utilize for our data analysis. In general, once we've got the data entered into our spreadsheet, we would generate certain descriptive statistics of the overall data. Then we begin sorting it into our subgroups that we are interested in. Once we've decided what's important and we want to talk about, that's when we create the graphical illustrations, and once we've got the pictures, then we sit down and we tell the story of what the picture tells us and how we utilize that information. It's a good idea thereafter to move the extraneous information and results to an appendix, get it out of the body of our report so that we can focus on that which is most important. Just a couple of tips on survey construction, and these are my own views, just based on my own experience, that I believe are important and follow myself. I always make a distinction between the need to know versus the like to know. When somebody tells me that their group would like to know something, I tend to be very standoffish of that. I want to be told, why do you need to know this? Because this process of undertaking a survey initiative, once again, is very time-consuming, it's very complex. And if you can't tell me that you need this information, but rather you're just curious, chances are I'm going to invest a lot of time and effort, and you're not going to utilize the information because you really don't know how. And so I always distinguish when people come to me and they say, we'd like to know, versus those individuals who say, we really need to have this information if we're going to make an informed decision. I always suggest that unless you know precisely how you're going to use the information, don't bother asking. Don't bother people asking information that you have no idea how to utilize. You're wasting your own time, your own resources, and you're wasting their time. In general, I tend to shoot for 5 minutes or less. Surveys that tend to take 10 minutes or longer are much, much more difficult to do a good job of getting responses. Once again, each question needs to be a discrete choice of yes or no, or questions you can quantify into meaningful numbers. And that would be 3-point, 5-point, 7-point scale of agree, disagree, or a straight up yes or no. In general, I don't like open-ended questions. We always want people to tell us why, but if we ask 200 people why on a given question and we get 200 answers, it's very, very difficult to get ascertain any meaning out of 200 different responses. And so I tend to be very leery of asking open-ended questions, but I also am a believer in offering an opportunity for a person to explain themselves. But I make why optional. If people want to explain why they've responded the way they did, I give them the chance, but I don't force them to. And when I find myself undertaking a survey where the survey won't let me advance unless I tell them why, that's when I cut it off, because I may or may not choose to do so. Now, there are alternatives to surveys, some of which are perfectly acceptable in my view, and we'll talk about a couple of them and a couple alternatives that I have used. And indeed, a few simple alternatives is just simply query meeting participants. It's a form of your key informants, and if, for example, you have some sort of a gathering where you want to conduct a community health needs assessment, a behavioral health needs assessment, and you have the right people there, just simply ask them what their views are. And indeed, I've undertaken a host of community health needs assessments, and I'm always asked, how many people should be there? I say, I don't know, just get the right people there. And when my local contacts can assure me that they do have the right people in attendance, what more do you need? You simply ask them the questions. If the right people are there, you ask them, what are the greatest needs? What's the preferred solution? What's the barriers to the solution? And you can make a perfectly legitimate decision with regard to priority based on that. And so if you've got the right people at your meeting, simply ask those people. Another alternative is what I call the poor persons survey. It's everyone at your meeting plus 5. And the idea is if, say, for example, you get 30 people to your meeting, and you distribute a survey, they all respond to it, and then you ask all of the survey respondents to take 5 blank copies of your survey out into the community and obtain responses from wherever they go. Get them from folks at work, get them from folks at church, get them from people in the grocery store. And if everybody collects those 5 surveys, you've got 150 surveys plus your original 30. 180 responses. It's not going to be representative, but it's a lot of input. And indeed, I've utilized this when we're trying to keep the costs of a given program low, but we want to gather information from respondents outside of our meeting, from the broader community. I've utilized this method, and with some good success. And indeed, in one particular instance, I think of a rural county that I worked in, about 2,000 residents overall in that county. And what I do is I essentially, after our meeting, I say, okay, go out and gather your 5 additional surveys. And I tell them that you've got 3 days. And then you drop them all off at a local point, mail them to me, and I'll be back in 2 weeks with the results. And essentially, they said, you watch us. And in 3 days in this particular county, of 2,000 people, they gathered 452 surveys in 3 days. Just about killed my student to enter all that data and get me set to go for the next meeting. And so essentially, everyone at your meeting plus 5. And that will gather lots of input. Looking at some other alternatives of local data gathering, we have a number of opportunities that exist, various kinds of local institutions that gather unique and detailed data, such things as hospitals, police and law enforcement, or our local courts, police patrol encounters involving apparent mental health kinds of concerns, jail inmates with apparent mental health, counts by type of hospital emergency room visit with perhaps a psychiatric diagnosis attached to it, counts by various types of individuals who might need some short-term intervention at a crisis center, and a host of other kinds of local data opportunities. There are some, these do present opportunities insofar as it can be very unique information that can shed light on the scale of a problem or an emerging problem within our community. So there are lots of possibilities, but there are some real barriers to collecting that local data in terms of the time and cost of the agency. There are a host of privacy considerations, and many institutions are very attuned to patient confidentiality, or what is known as the HIPAA requirements, federal requirements for privacy. And there are also challenges associated with certain administrative prerogatives. One administrator might think that it's perfectly acceptable. The next person comes along and says, no, no, we can't do that. And so there are opportunities, but perhaps some challenges that go along with obtaining that specialized information. I might just simply mention one initiative that we've undertaken with the CAPE program in an earlier rendition of our program that is in and around the notion of community surveillance. We had a project in one version of our CAPE program that involved something that we called index communities. And what we did there was to essentially impanel a representative group of community observers who actually deal with various kinds of behavioral health needs and challenges within the community. It was an internet-based survey using something that we use in the university called Qualtrics, but perhaps something like SurveyMonkey, more people are familiar with. It's the same sort of a system. And indeed, we just asked them to periodically respond to what they were observing within the community in relation to a list of behavioral health challenges, and simply to report whether or not things were getting better, getting worse, or staying about the same. And indeed, that was a very relatively easy, very inexpensive process, and we found that many of our panelists were more than happy to help, just simply because they wanted to contribute to the community welfare. We'll wrap up by just talking a little bit about the public value of health interventions and the notion of making evidence-based arguments. At our CAPE website, you will find this. It's a copy of a webinar that was offered by Dr. Mark Skidmore, Measuring and Building Public Value of Health Intervention Programs. And I think he makes a couple of valuable observations. And indeed, Mark is a very highly skilled researcher, and he undertook the effort to do his best effort at trying to essentially conduct a cost-benefit analysis of a given health intervention, and he was able to identify a variety of benefits associated with the intervention in terms of individual income associated with the individual who had received that intervention, as well as the enhancement of their quality of life and their family's quality of life. Society avoided costs and the tax revenues saved associated with responding to that particular problem. And he contrasted that with the costs, the government costs of the startup and operating costs of a given program, and ultimately calculated a net benefit associated with that health intervention. Now, his conclusion ultimately was that a thoughtful but imperfect evaluation is far better than no evaluation at all. And indeed, of course, there needs to be certain assumptions that are made, and perhaps we need to borrow information or data from elsewhere with regard to our various kinds of cost assumptions and so forth. But nonetheless, a careful, albeit imperfect evaluation is better than none at all. The takeaway that I think is important from that is essentially be prepared to make your case. And here is where I sort of utilize the notion that a new road grader always wins. And I've seen this when I've attended local government meetings, where you might have an individual, a group come in to your county commission, your county board, and say, oh, the children of our community need this, or the elderly of our community need that. And the response that I've seen is, we need to buy a new road grader. That's $150,000. We can't afford you. And so you need to be ready with your arguments as to why it makes sense to make your investment in human capital. Making evidence-based arguments to document the need, to document ultimately the value of the success and the cost effectiveness of your initiative is essential. Now, stories are good, but dollars and cents are better. And so my suggestion is, where at all possible, do the homework necessary to come in with your evidence-based arguments of need, and your chances are a little bit better that you'll have some success in making your requests. So with that, we'll put a wrap on it for this session. In our next couple of videos, we'll talk about assessing community preparedness, identifying essential stakeholders within the community, doing asset inventories, as well as understanding community history. And then we'll talk a bit about building coalitions and public relations in and around our community initiative. And so with that, I'll put a wrap on it. Once again, here is our contact information. You are more than welcome to contact me directly at this phone or email address, and I'll be happy to discuss your initiative with you and help you in any way that I can to prepare your own community action plan. So with that, I appreciate your attention and look forward to visiting with you again. Thank you very much.